At 8 p.m. Eastern Time on July 29, 2026, U.S. News Central Command began what it would call, in a single terse public statement, a powerful response. For 2 straight hours, American aircraft struck dozens of Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps targets scattered across Iran, military command centers, missile and drone facilities, coastal surveillance and defense sites, and maritime assets tied to Iran's ongoing campaign against shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. Explosions were heard in Bandar Abbas, the southern port city that sits on the edge of the strait, and around nearby islands in the Persian Gulf, according to Iranian state broadcasters. By Central Command's own account, this was a direct answer to something that had happened less than 24 hours earlier, a coordinated Iranian ballistic missile attack aimed at American forces that failed completely, every missile intercepted. Why the United States specifically targeted Iran's command infrastructure rather than simply answering strike for strike, and why the idea that the next strike could be bigger is not just a dramatic headline. It reflects a documented, publicly stated threat that both governments had already put on the record. And understanding it requires going back further than a single night in July. Skipping the context is exactly how a story like this ends up sounding more dramatic or more misleading than the underlying facts actually support. This war began on February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes that killed Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, along with senior figures across the country's military and political leadership. Israeli officials say roughly 30 bombs were dropped on the compound where he was sheltering. President Trump announced the operation on social media that same day, calling Khamenei's death the single greatest chance for the Iranian people to take back their country, and the Pentagon described what followed as major combat operations, a campaign U.S. Central Command would later name Operation Epic Fury. Within the first 100 hours of that campaign, American forces reportedly struck nearly 2,000 targets across Iran. 6 American service members were killed in the earliest days of Iranian retaliation, and by the first week of March, monitoring groups had already documented more than 1,000 civilian deaths inside Iran. In the 5 months since that opening weekend, this conflict has moved through several distinct phases. An initial period of intense strikes and retaliation across the region. A naval blockade the United States imposed on Iranian ports starting in mid-April, which the Pentagon estimated had cost Iran roughly $4.8 billion in lost oil revenue by the start of May alone. A brief window of diplomatic engagement in June, built around a signed memorandum of understanding and a 2-week ceasefire negotiated with Pakistan's help. And then, in early July, the collapse of that framework, followed by a sustained, nearly nightly American strike campaign that the July 29th powerful response ultimately belongs to. That nightly campaign deserves to be walked through in detail because its scale is genuinely unusual, and understanding the actual documented pattern, rather than treating July 29th as an isolated event, is what separates an accurate account from a sensationalized one. Central Command's own public statements show a sustained tempo running through the back half of July. An 11th consecutive night of strikes on July 22nd, aimed in Central Command's language at degrading Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. A 13th consecutive night on July 23rd, lasting more than 2 hours and hitting what Reuters described as Iranian military command centers, drone storage facilities, communication networks, coastal surveillance sites, and maritime capabilities. A 9th consecutive night on July 19th, the same night a U.S. serviceman was killed and another wounded according to reporting at the time. This was not a single dramatic strike followed by a pause. It was a continuous, near-nightly campaign that had already been running for close to 2 weeks before Trump briefly called off the bombing to allow renewed negotiations on a Friday, only for talks to break down and for Iran to attempt its own retaliatory strike days later. That is a pattern worth naming clearly, because treating any single night as a sudden, isolated escalation out of nowhere misses just how long this specific rhythm of strikes had already been running. The trigger for the July 29th powerful response was, as Central Command stated plainly, the failed Iranian ballistic missile attack the night before, and this detail deserves precision rather than exaggeration, because it is one of the more remarkable, well-documented outcomes of the entire war. Iran had spent weeks signaling that a major retaliatory strike was coming, following the collapse of the ceasefire framework and a series of American strikes through early and mid-July. On July 28th, Tuesday, it launched that strike, a coordinated missile attack aimed directly at American forces based in Jordan and elsewhere in the region. Central Command reported that every missile was intercepted before reaching its target. Jordan's own military reported separately and independently that it had shot down several of the incoming missiles using its own air defense systems. No American casualties were attributed to the missile attack itself. By any standard, that is a significant defensive success. And it is the specific event that set up everything that followed: President Trump's blunt promise on Fox News that the United States would beat the aggressor badly, and the 2-hour strike campaign against IRGC infrastructure that followed roughly 24 hours later, beginning at 8 p.m. Eastern and concluding at 10 p.m. Now to the target list itself, because precision here matters if we want to avoid the kind of vague, unverifiable claims that erode an audience's trust. Central Command's public release described the July 29th strikes as hitting Iranian military command centers, missile and drone facilities, coastal surveillance and defense sites, and maritime capabilities. And each of those categories serves a distinct function worth explaining rather than glossing over. Command centers are where IRGC officers plan and coordinate operations, the actual physical infrastructure behind decisions like the missile attack the night before. Missile and drone facilities are the storage and launch infrastructure Iran depends on to mount exactly that kind of attack in the first place. Coastal surveillance and defense sites are the sensors and radar systems Iran uses to track shipping and detect incoming threats along the Strait of Hormuz. And maritime capabilities generally refers to the naval and small boat assets Iran has used to enforce its repeated closures of that same waterway, through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil normally flows. Central Command's stated rationale for hitting all 4 categories together was to further diminish the threats Iran and its proxies pose to American forces, commercial shipping, and neighboring Gulf countries, language that frames the strikes as systemic degradation rather than narrow retaliation for a single incident. Notably, Central Command did not disclose the exact number of targets struck that night, a level of vagueness that stands in contrast to Iran's own Revolutionary Guard, which has generally. Earlier in the war, in February, Iranian retaliatory strikes on the United Arab Emirates killed 3 foreign workers, Pakistani, Nepali, and Bangladeshi nationals, and injured dozens more, a reminder that casualties in this conflict have repeatedly fallen on third country nationals working across the Gulf, people with no direct connection to either government's decision-making, killed or injured simply by virtue of where they happened to be employed when a strike landed nearby. Any accurate account of a single night's strikes needs to sit inside that larger, sobering total, rather than treating it as a clean, bloodless exchange of military hardware. Now to the part of this story that carries the most weight, and the part most likely to be misread if handled carelessly, the idea that the next strike could be bigger. This phrase is grounded in specific, documented statements from officials on both sides, not speculation. Throughout this period, President Trump repeatedly floated the possibility of expanding American targeting beyond military infrastructure to include Iranian energy facilities and bridges, civilian and dual-use infrastructure well outside the categories Central Command had actually been hitting through its nightly campaign. Iran's government responded to that specific threat with one of its own. Officials warned that if the United States followed through and struck energy or infrastructure targets, Iran would retaliate against regional oil, gas, electricity, and economic facilities across the wider Gulf, pulling countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates directly into a more damaging category of warfare than anything either side had committed to up to that point, a threat that has already partly materialized, since the UAE confirmed in August that Iran had launched a missile at an oil tanker attempting to transit the strait. This is also where the story intersects with international law, and it is worth stating that connection plainly rather than overstating or ignoring it. The 1949 Geneva Conventions, the foundational body of international humanitarian law governing armed conflict, prohibit attacks on infrastructure considered essential to civilian survival, a category that includes power grids and fuel systems civilians depend on for daily life. International law experts in the United States stated publicly, first in April 2026, and again as similar threats resurfaced later in the war, that strikes of the kind Trump had floated could potentially constitute war crimes under that framework. These are documented warnings about the category of action being discussed, not a claim that such a strike has actually occurred, and not a prediction of what happens next, but the fact that credentialed legal experts felt it necessary to say this on the record more than once over the course of the war is itself a verifiable data point, and part of why a strike on energy infrastructure represents a meaningfully different category of risk than the nightly campaign that had already been running through most of July. There is a structural reason command centers specifically kept showing up on Central Command's target lists night after night throughout this campaign, and it is worth explaining the military logic plainly rather than assuming it is self-evident. A command center is where an operation like the failed July 28th missile attack gets planned and coordinated before it is ever launched. Repeatedly targeting that infrastructure, rather than simply reacting to individual attacks as they occur, reflects a strategy aimed at degrading Iran's capacity to organize its next move, not just punishing its last one. That said, an honest accounting of this campaign also has to acknowledge its limits. Iran launched its most significant operation of the war, the July 28th missile attack, after roughly 3 weeks of nightly American strikes specifically aimed at degrading its command and control infrastructure. That timing tells you something important. Repeated strikes on command centers had clearly not eliminated Iran's capacity to plan and attempt a coordinated operation, even though that operation ultimately failed on execution. Command infrastructure in modern warfare can be dispersed, rebuilt, and relocated faster than a strike campaign can permanently eliminate it. And that nuance is exactly what separates an accurate account of this campaign from an oversimplified one implying each night of strikes was steadily winning the war outright. It is also worth explaining why this specific strike carried the name Powerful Response in Central Command's own release, rather than simply being folded into the running count of consecutive nightly strikes the way most of July's campaign had been. Most of the nightly strikes throughout July were described in fairly routine, procedural language, degrading Iran's ability to threaten shipping, continuing a sustained campaign. The July 29th release was different in tone. It was explicitly tied to a single triggering event, the failed missile attack, and explicitly framed as a powerful answer to it. Language that signals a strike calibrated for both military effect and public messaging, aimed as much at demonstrating resolve to Tehran and to the American public as at any specific tactical objective. That distinction matters for accuracy. Conflating a routinely worded nightly strike with a deliberately amplified, powerful response would blur two different categories of military communication that Central Command itself clearly intended to keep separate. There is a reasonable question worth asking directly. Why did Iran attempt its most significant operation of the war in the middle of a nightly campaign specifically targeting the command infrastructure it would need to plan and execute exactly that kind of attack? The public record does not offer a definitive answer from Iranian officials themselves, who have not given a detailed public explanation of their decision-making around the timing. What can be stated accurately is the sequence of events, weeks of nightly strikes on command and control infrastructure, followed by an attempted large-scale missile operation that failed in its entirety, followed by an intensified American response explicitly tied to that failure. Whether Iran calculated that delaying the attack risked losing the capability to attempt it at all, or whether the timing reflected internal political or military pressures, is not something the available reporting resolves with confidence, and an accurate account should say so, rather than fill that gap with a confident-sounding but unsupported explanation. The regional dimension of this episode also deserves precise treatment, because countries beyond Iran and the United States absorbed real, documented consequences from this specific exchange. Jordan's role in intercepting several of the ballistic missiles on July the 28th reflects a level of integration into American-led regional air defense coordination that had been built and tested over the preceding 5 months of war. And the same period saw Jordanian and American personnel and equipment absorb damage from earlier Iranian retaliatory strikes, underscoring that Jordan's role in this conflict has never been limited to providing defensive support from a position of complete safety. On the question of Iran's own military messaging, it is worth noting that Iranian officials have not been shy about publicizing their retaliatory operations, which offers a useful, if one-sided, window into how Tehran frames its own actions for a domestic audience. In the hours after the July 29th strikes, the Revolutionary Guard declared it would punish the aggressor and warned that it maintained full control of the Strait of Hormuz, insisting that a stranger who had come from thousands of kilometers away would not be allowed to interfere. That pattern of detailed public claims from Tehran, contrasted with Central Command's own comparatively terse statements, which frequently did not provide additional detail on the number of targets struck, is itself a notable asymmetry in how the two militaries have chosen to communicate about this war, one worth flagging for anyone trying to assess the relative reliability of claims coming from either side. It is also worth addressing the economic dimension of this war directly, because the strikes on command centers and infrastructure are not happening in isolation from the broader economic pressure campaign that has been running in parallel throughout 2026. The Pentagon's own estimate that the April through May naval blockade cost Iran approximately $4.8 billion in lost oil revenue by the start of May gives a concrete sense of the financial pressure Tehran has been operating under, even before accounting for the direct cost of rebuilding repeatedly struck military infrastructure. By August, that pressure had compounded into a documented economic crisis, with Iranian workers describing rampant inflation, rising debt, and a currency that had lost significant value against the dollar over the previous year, according to Iran's own state-linked labor news agency. Trump's comments in an August 7th interview with Axios describing Iran's huge inflation and lack of money were not simply rhetorical flourishes. They reflected that documented reality. And he added that the naval blockade had left Iran unable to properly pay its own troops. An accurate account of the next strike could be bigger as to sit alongside this economic context, because a country facing severe documented financial strain has different incentives around escalation than a country operating without that constraint. and it is part of why intermediary channels were active at all by early August. A responsible treatment of an active, ongoing conflict should not freeze the picture at its most dramatic moment and stop there. As of the second week of August 2026, roughly 2 weeks after the July 29th strikes, the situation had shifted again in ways that complicate any simple narrative of continuous, escalating warfare. Iran confirmed that messages were being exchanged with the United States through intermediaries, though Tehran specifically declined to characterize this as formal negotiations, with Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi stating there was no possibility of resuming direct talks unless Washington addressed what he called its violations of the June Memorandum of Understanding. President Trump, discussing the state of affairs publicly on August 7th, described the American posture in notably measured terms. "We are low-keying it," he said, adding, "We are only semi-negotiating with them. We are just watching Iran with its huge inflation and the fact they have no money." That is a meaningfully different tone than the very hard, they know it's coming language from roughly 10 days earlier, and it is worth including precisely because leaving it out would make the war sound more actively escalatory right now than the most current reporting actually supports. At the same time, it would be equally inaccurate to describe early August as any kind of resolution. Reporting in the days that followed indicated the Pentagon was actively pushing American defense companies to boost weapons production, driven by concerns about depleted stockpiles after 5 months of sustained combat operations. And that is not the posture of a military establishment that considers this conflict close to finished. It is the posture of one preparing for the possibility that it continues at real cost for a good while longer. Diplomats exchanging messages through intermediaries and a Pentagon quietly working to rebuild weapons stocks are two things entirely capable of being true at the same time, and presenting only one or the other would distort the actual picture as it stood in the first weeks of August. Pulling this together, an accurate, properly sourced answer to what the next strike could be, bigger actually means, it refers to a specific, publicly threatened category of escalation. Strikes on Iranian energy infrastructure and bridges that sit above the tier of purely military targets, the command centers, missile facilities, and radar sites that defined the nightly campaign running through most of July 2026. That threat was made explicitly by President Trump on more than one occasion. It was met with an explicit Iranian counter-threat to target Gulf energy infrastructure in response. And it drew explicit, on-record warnings from international law experts about potential war crimes exposure under the Geneva Conventions. None of that is speculation or dramatization. It is a summary of statements actually made by named officials and institutions over the course of this conflict. What remains genuinely uncertain, and what an honest account has to say plainly, rather than resolve for the sake of a clean ending, is whether that threatened escalation actually happens. As of early to mid-August, the signals are genuinely mixed, intermediary channel messages suggesting some appetite for de-escalation on both sides, alongside a Pentagon actively preparing for the possibility of a much longer fight. A responsible answer to how this ends is that nobody outside a small circle of decision-makers in Washington and Tehran currently knows, and any account that claims otherwise, with total confidence in either direction, is telling you more than the actual reporting supports. It is also worth spending a moment on why the successful interception of every missile in Iran's July 28th attack matters as more than just a single night's tactical result, because its significance extends into exactly the kind of infrastructure strain the Pentagon was publicly addressing by early August. Layered missile defense, the kind of system capable of intercepting a coordinated ballistic missile salvo in its entirety, depends on a finite supply of interceptor missiles, munitions that have to be manufactured, stockpiled, and, when used, replaced. A single successful, complete interception is a genuine defensive achievement. A war that keeps generating nights like that over and over across 5 months of sustained conflict is also a war that consumes that finite category of military hardware at a rate that outpaces normal peacetime production and replenishment cycles, which is precisely the concern reflected in the Pentagon's early August push for defense companies to accelerate weapons production. That is not a sign American forces were losing the tactical exchanges. The documented record shows they generally were not. But it is a sign that sustaining this level of defensive success over an indefinite timeline required addressing a supply-side problem that months of continuous combat operations had exposed. An accurate account of the next strike could be bigger should include this detail, because it complicates any simple assumption that American military capacity in this theater is unlimited, or that further escalation carries no cost on the U.S. side of the ledger, even as the immediate battlefield picture continued to favor American and Allied forces defensively. Compare that discipline to the shorthand that tends to creep into war coverage under pressure to keep an audience engaged. A single night of strikes described as though it settles the war's outcome. A threatened escalation described as though it has already happened. A diplomatic channel referenced vaguely enough that it could mean anything from a serious breakthrough to a single unanswered phone call. Each of those shortcuts might buy a few extra seconds of attention in the moment, but they are also exactly the kind of claims that do not hold up once an audience checks them against what actually happens next, week after week, which erodes trust in a channel far more than a single underperforming video ever could. The more durable approach, even if it is less immediately dramatic, is naming sources, naming dates, naming the specific officials who said specific things, and being explicit about the difference between a documented fact and a documented threat that has not yet been carried out. One last point worth making directly, because it speaks to the trust problem this kind of reporting is meant to address. Covering an active, ongoing war responsibly means resisting the temptation to manufacture a false sense of closure at the end of a video. A war that has already run for nearly 6 months, moved through multiple ceasefires and collapses, and involves a half dozen countries beyond the two primary belligerents, is not a story that resolves neatly inside a single script, no matter how the title is phrased. The honest approach, and generally the one that builds durable audience trust rather than short-term engagement followed by disillusionment, is to clearly separate 3 categories every time. What has been confirmed by named sources and official statements. What has been explicitly threatened or stated as a possibility by officials with the authority to act on it. And what remains genuinely unknown. The July 29th strikes on Iran's command centers belongs squarely in the first category. The threat of strikes on energy infrastructure belongs in the second. And the actual trajectory of this war over the coming weeks, whether the intermediary talks between Washington and Tehran produce something durable, or whether the next round of strikes turns out to be the bigger one officials have already warned about, belongs, honestly, in the third.